So record button is on, and I'll turn it over to you.
The officer hair. Yeah, I stole all this hair product from this Navy SEAL that I know, so I greased it up real nice for everybody. So, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for having me. I really appreciate it. You know, so I was talking to Steve earlier, and we kind of had a plan, and I'm going to do what they tell you not to do. And you know, we plan to go right on this thing, and I'm going to go left at the door. So don't kill me. So basically, I put together kind of a bunch of talking points on the seven practices from Holly Burkett that Steve has kind of based a lot of the discussion in this course on, and then I put together kind of my thoughts on each one of those, and I figured that, you know, I'd go and I would just start talking through them, and then I was thinking throughout today, and I was like, well, nobody's going to really want to hear some sort of lecture, and so I was like, you've been sitting in this class for however long doing that, and so I'd rather talk about each one of these kind of collectively and get people's inputs, because I haven't obviously been a part of the class, and so I'm interested in learning from you guys on kind of each one of these, but then also really I want to share how I've seen these things work in the real world, and I've not ever seen these 7 principles until Steve sent them to me about a week ago, and I read through them, and it was like, wow, I really wish that I had seen some of this, because it would have been very valuable in some of the roles that I held. And so I thought that maybe that's how we would have more of a collective conversation versus me kind of getting up here and giving you my thoughts on all of them and then saying, you know, okay, what do you think? Because nobody's going to remember or probably care as much. So that's kind of my thought. If that's good with you, Steve, then maybe I'll give a quick bio on myself, but I know that, you know, Steve sent everybody my bio, but look, the realization is that I've been out for 5 years and I don't have all the answers. I don't even know if I have some of the answers. What I know is that I've had a tremendous amount of experiences, both good and bad. I've learned from both of them. I don't know if I've made well, I can tell you I haven't made all the right choices, but I have made probably better choices in the positive than I made in the negative, because transition, which I think is something that that's been a big topic of discussion in this class, is kind of what happens at transition, what happens in what I call the real world when you get out, and there's quite a difference. And so you know, quick little background on me. I grew up in the Northeast. I'm from Rhode Island. I grew up in Boston, so I have kind of, you know, a crappy attitude towards everybody. And I went into the Army because I wanted to be a journalist, and I was going to be the next Tom Brokaw. And now I'm realizing, as I talk to a lot of people, not this group because you guys are a bit older, but I speak to people now and they don't know who Tom Brokaw is, which is quite scary for me, because that means I'm getting old. And then 9/11 was my junior year in college, and I said, oh, I'm going to go be a war correspondent. And then after I watched what we did in Afghanistan, what we did in the invasion into Iraq in 2003, I was like, well, forget that. I'm not going to go be a war correspondent. I'm going to go make a difference in the world. And so I went to the recruiter outside of Boston, and I said, I want to go to officer candidate school. And I was selected for officer candidate school. I went to Benning, spent my time there, and I was going to be an aviation officer, and then on the last day before you submit your list of 10, I was like, no, I want to go in the infantry, and I got what I asked for, and I spent my first 3 years in the infantry as an infantry platoon leader. Went to Iraq 2005, 2006 for a year, and then I transitioned over to Special Forces. And then I spent the rest of my time in 10th Special Forces Group. I was very fortunate. I spent 3 years as a detachment commander. I was a battalion AS3. I was the 10th Group AS3. And then I was a general's aide, and I was the Special Operations Command Africa general's aide for my last year. And then, as happens to many people, I came home from that. My wife had taken our 4-year-old daughter and said, you haven't been home in the last, however long that was. At that point, it was about 12 and a half years in the Army. We'd been together in college, and she's like, I last saw you in 2003, and they moved to New York, and I had to make a decision of what I wanted to do. And so that was the end of my military career. And so I went to New York. I went to NYU to get my MBA because similar to what you're probably, what some of the reasons why you may want to be taking these classes and taking the course is that I think the military does a great job of training people for their next job. They do a really good job of every time you get promoted, every time you go to the next level, they say you need to go to school. And I tried to get a lot of different jobs. I tried to be a consultant at McKinsey. I tried to go to Deloitte. I tried to go to all the big management consulting firms. I interviewed at Google. I interviewed at every company that had job openings that I thought I could do. And when I tell you that that was probably upwards of 200 jobs that I applied to for a total of about 5 interviews, that's realistically what it was. And then I was talking to a guy one day who was a former 5th group officer, and he was in, he worked at KPMG, and he told me, we met once, and he said, what do you want to do? And I gave him like a list of 15 things. And he said, where do you want to live? And I gave him a list of like 10 cities, like, LA, Boston, Miami, Chicago, like all the big cities in the US. And so he said, okay, well, that sounds good. Why don't we talk in a couple of weeks and then we'll have a follow-up. And so a couple of weeks later we speak, and he says, well, where do you want to go? And I give him this list of 10, and he says, what do you want to do? And I give him a list of 10, and he's like, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do. If you tell me exactly what you want to do and where you want to go, then I can make a phone call for you and I can help you and get you a job. But because you have no idea where you want to go and you're telling me you do anything and you don't care where it is, then I can't help you. And so that was a real eye-opener for me, because I realized that I didn't have a lot of this. Not only was I not networking correctly and talking to the right people, but I probably didn't have a lot of the skills to do the things that I said I was trying to do. And so I took a job at Merrill Lynch as a financial advisor. I knew I may or may not like it. And my very first day there at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I had to go for a walk because I had no idea what I had just done, as I sat in a cubicle staring at myself saying, this is like the worst thing that I could have ever done and made the worst mistake. And so I stayed at Merrill Lynch for a year and a half. It was actually a great experience. I learned a lot about the financial markets. And then I had an opportunity to go to Snapchat. I had been linked up with former 7th group psychologist who was running HR and recruiting at Snapchat, and we had a mutual friend. He introduced us, and I went out and was lucky enough to get the job, and I ran global security and was the director of global security at Snapchat. And that was a great opportunity to build a program right after the company went public in an industry that I kind of knew and had a lot of experience in. I never worked in corporate America. I never worked at a public company, but there was a lot of applicable things from my past experience that I thought we could build a great program. And we did that, and we got recognized by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security for the work that we did there, the programs that we built. I also made a lot of mistakes there. I pissed off the CEO. I tried to jam change down people's throats who were not prepared for change and didn't want change. And I took my position for granted with an understanding that they had hired me to be an impactful leader, which was all I knew coming out of the military. And when somebody tells you no, you tell them where to stick it and you keep going. Well, the corporate world doesn't work like that. You quickly find that you are no longer welcome at that organization in the real world. And so my entire chain of command, the guy under me, my boss who had brought me in, and the CFO all pissed the CEO off, and he chose a different course, and that was it. And that was a very tough lesson to learn in the corporate world. And so then I went and I had a chance to run security I had a choice to make, and I'll tell you this story because I'll give you the punchline sort of at the end, but I think it's valuable to listen. I had a decision to make, and the decision was between going to the is there a question? I'm seeing the chat.
Daryl's got a couple of questions he wants to ask you, but I'd ask Daryl to hold off and for everybody to hold off on questions until Frank gets through with his discussion and everything. Okay, Daryl?
Okay, so yeah, that's fine. So basically, I had a choice, and one choice was to go to run security at a company called US Foods, which is a $24 billion food distribution company. It's one of the largest in the world. And I was going to go be the chief security officer there. And then I had a opportunity. Then I had a offer from a Russian oligarch to go to LA and run security for a cannabis startup that he had invested $100 million into. And the moral of this story is that when a Fortune 10 or 15 company offers you an executive position, you take that job. And it doesn't matter what home run you think you're going to swing for. You should think very wisely before you do that. And me being me, and in this, some of these points I put together to talk to you, I said that risk is part of the experience. I took the swing of the bat and I went to this cannabis company for a Russian oligarch investor. And I worked there for about a month and had a meeting, and they said, what are we going to do about security? And I said, we're not going to do anything about security because your organization is a disaster. Everybody you hired is the wrong person. They have no idea what they're doing here. Everybody is about between the ages of 24 and 25 years old. You've invested $100 million and there's nothing here. I don't even know where the money is. I can't tell you. And so very quickly I became the chief operating officer, and then I became the CEO after I got a hold of the financials and exposed a tremendous amount of fraud, waste, and abuse. And what I would tell you is that nobody stole the money, they just misappropriated the funds. And so we put that company on a path to and a trajectory to build that towards a profitable company very quickly. That also required me to fire 100 people on my first day, fully in charge, including the managing partners. And then that company was shut down out of COVID because the Russian got himself involved in some nasty stuff in Russia. And so that company, unfortunately, although it had a tremendous amount of opportunity, was a great experience in how do you build an organization from nothing, which was very different from what I had experienced at Snap. And so then I realized that I need to go do some stuff for myself, and starting to work for people it may not be what I want to do. And so I started my own business, and I started doing some business consulting for folks I know. I started getting involved with leadership development and organizational management. I started doing some security consulting, and now I work on a bunch of M&A projects for different mergers and acquisitions. I work on building a private equity fund, and we're buying a couple of companies, and we're putting some folks out of the military and out of special operations in charge of those companies as CEOs and COOs, and then getting the investing and the investment behind that for them to be successful. And then I started a podcast here in the next couple of weeks is going to launch, which I'm going to talk to a whole bunch of people about how they've been successful in their careers. And because I turned 40 this year, everything hurts. So I started doing yoga. Now I have 2 kids, and I don't do as much running as I should, but I feel pretty good about it. So that's me. I think it's important to share that with you because there's the real world paints a picture, and the real world paints a picture that can be very rosy at times. And we have a lot going on with social media. There's a lot going on in how you present yourself, but you got to own your story. And your story is impactful because your experiences are what make you. And to me, the experiences that I've had since I've been in the military, being in the military was one of the best, it was, if not the best experience that I had, and I'm not sure I was ready for it to be over. That transition period sucks. And for some people, and anybody who tells you that it's just going to end, when you get out, you're going to immediately go and everything is going to be great, and it's all rosy, and it's what I call the up and to the right trajectory. They're probably full of crap. So that's it. That's my story. If you want to talk about any of that, we can, or we can kind of go into some of these points.
So Daryl, if you want to, Daryl, you had a question, or a couple questions. Go ahead and ask Fran before we move on. And as I just put in the chat box too, that having a little bandwidth issues. So if you guys want, just shut down the video feed. That'll help the bandwidth out a little bit. And just Fran and I'll be up on video. And if you guys have a question or want to provide some feedback, then activate your video to come on and talk to Fran. So Daryl, do you have anything?
Yeah, hey, Fran. So I actually, went through your bio, and a couple of things kind of stuck out to me. One being that you chose to do security consulting for a cannabis industry, right? So were there were there ethical things that may have contributed, like did you had to, like, I don't know, like fight some ethical things, or like, because for me, like, if I was going to go consult or do security for something like that, I like, I'd be all about it. But like, I know a lot of people in the military, right, like, weed and everything that has to do with that, like, is completely, off limits. So what was the deciding factor whenever it came to that?
Sure. Well, I'll give you kind of a couple of different answers. So number one, no, I didn't care. It didn't matter to me. I think it's a crazy industry, like absolutely crazy, and I can kind of explain that. I'll say that when I left the military, I had a TS clearance. The FBI picked up my security clearance when I was at SNAP as part of the what's called the Domestic Security Advisory Council, which is the FBI's partnership with private industry in the security sector. And so they held my secret clearance. When I went to the cannabis company, I did not lose my secret clearance because I was in cannabis. There were questions around it because I was working for a Russian oligarch. So that, on the priority of the federal government, ranks much higher than you being in a federally illegal industry. That being said, it's legal, right? It's legal. So you have to decide for yourself if this is something you want to be involved in. What I will say is that I had more ethical and business practice issues at Snapchat than I did at the cannabis company. And that, now, the issues that occurred at the cannabis company were immaturity. That is an extremely immature industry there. And so I have a point here, and I'll make it because I think it's important. And hold on, let me just check. It was about
That's super interesting, actually. I'm ready to hear that.
So if you look, if you go to the seven, if you go to the seven practices, right, and you look at foster collaboration, right, number 6, okay, and you talk about foster collaboration, connection, and community. All right, so I'm not sure the average age of this group, but I think it's a little bit older than 23 to 25, right, Steve?
Yeah.
So I'm 40, right? I turned 40 this year, and there's a marked difference between what we understand and how we approach interaction with people and leadership than the younger generation. And I saw this here, I saw this at Snap, and I saw this now working as a consultant. Primarily, I'm doing a big project for my brother's company. My brother's 5 years younger, but there's actually a big difference between generations at 35 to 40, and you see this as you start to break down organizations. And technology, okay, if you look at foster collaboration, connection, and community, it's all about the technology. Everything is about the technology. And so there's this theory of inclusiveness right now. And I think there's a part in here in the readings that use the term inclusiveness, and there's this perception that inclusiveness is about being nice to everybody, and you have to make everybody feel good. Well, that's not true. You need everybody in an organization to feel good for their morale, their growth, their performance, right? You want them to perform, and you want them to be comfortable there. But inclusiveness is about working together, and it's fostering an environment that in the military you take for granted, and we take it for granted in the military because you're like-minded. Everybody's there to achieve the same goal. Everybody's there for the same cause, the same reason. That's not true in the corporate world. There's a mission, and companies have a mission. And one of the great things about leading organizations is you can develop that mission, especially if you're there early on and you have influence. Then you get to sit there and actually say, what's the mission, right? What are the key tasks? What's the end state? And I did that at Genius Fund. I did that at Snap. Literally took the handbook out of the MDMP and said, what's the commander's intent? What's the mission statement? What are the key tasks? And what's the end state? And then translated that language into a more corporate speak. But creating the collaboration and getting everybody to actually get on the same page because they want to is extremely challenging in the real world. And so if you think about the technology, 20 years ago, when I was in undergrad, and I graduated in 2003, so it's only 18 years ago. I mean, we barely used our computers. It was like the first iteration of laptops that actually functioned. Email, you got like 2 emails a week. And now companies don't even operate on email. I mean, one of the guys who was the managing partner at Genius literally walked around the room and told people if you emailed him, he was going to fire you, which is absolutely the wrong thing to ever say to anybody. But still, like there was no iPhone, right? I didn't have a cell phone until like 2005, right? Like after I got back from Iraq. And so now it's Slack, it's Google Workplace.
Yeah.
I mean, Microsoft Sharepoint came out in 2014. I was the 10th group AS3, and I remember when they rolled it out. And they were like, hey, we have this thing Sharepoint, because my job every Monday was to create the commander's update slides for the 10:30 meeting. So I get there 6 in the morning, and I have to consolidate all these slides. Obviously, none of the commanders ever did them, so I'd have to do it all in the first thing in the morning. And then they roll out Sharepoint, and I'm like, oh, you mean like I don't have 45 versions of the same thing every Monday morning? They just go in and update the slides, and that was revolutionary. Now that's obsolete. If you say the word Microsoft Sharepoint to everyone, they don't know what that is.
Yeah, right.
Now, I mean, I did a podcast recording last week with a guy on Zoom on his cell phone. I mean, a year ago at this point in time, every podcast was in person. People were flying all over the country. Now I'm setting up interviews for this podcast for the next like 6 months, and there's not one conversation. There's one conversation that I'm having about doing this thing in person, and that's because the guy lives up the street, like 45. And that's it. And no one else is talking about that. So technology has advanced so much, and that's what has become the actual, that's the foundation of collaboration. But the difference there's a huge difference between how we consume technology as our generation and how a younger generation does. And so I referenced my brother's company. I've been working all week on his HR and recruiting practices. Well, he last night between 2 a.m. and when I talked to him at like 10 this morning, he created an entire web app that took literally 3 years worth of poor execution and created an app on a website that brought it all together, because I gave him feedback over the last couple of weeks of all the inefficiencies, and in a couple of hours there's a whole new system. Like, you could never do that before.
Yeah.
And so I bring all this up because you asked a good question about this kind of like ethical stuff. I don't, for the industry, no, but it's all about who you work with, and it's about people. And so one of the big topics in the way that I evaluate companies and when I work with companies is what I call people, process, and technology. And so, because when you go into a project, you have to assess that organization. You have to be able to sit there and say, okay, well, there has to be some metric by which I measure the effectiveness of what's going on here. And so I look at the people, I look at the process and the technology, and I look at the technology. Now, that was not something that I actually thought about when I was in the military, and that was actually not even something that I learned in business school. It was when I went to Snap and I had a manager under me who would always say people, process, technology. And I was like, what the hell is this guy talking about? I'd stop saying that to me. So I don't know what that means. Here's the list of things I need you to do, and you're not doing them, and so we're going to have a difficult conversation. And so, but then over time, you're like, okay, wait, now I understand how you actually break that up. And so you learn that there are ways to break down organizations that that you're actually doing in the military. You're just not thinking that you're doing it, and then somebody quantifies it for you. You start looking, and you're like, okay, get it. And so when I look at people, it's like, who's actually working there? Are they the right people for the right jobs? Have they been developed properly for their roles? Do they have the right skills and the right character traits for success? And then I'll look at the process. What does the organization actually do? And then how do they do it? The military is great at explaining how you actually do things, and then showing you how to think, not what to think. Process flow diagrams. I mean, I spent the last month literally on PowerPoint, building process flow diagrams with every employee that works at this company, painstakingly on a shared video screen, saying, and what do you do next? Okay, what's the decision point? And then putting on there like, yes, no. Okay, now what? Right, to document process flow and thought process, put that in. And then you have technology, and it's what are the systems that people are using and the processes that they're using to do their jobs. How do they interrelate? How do the systems actually interrelate? And then how do the people in the process actually interact with the systems? And then does that tech enhance or inhibit the people in the process? And so those metrics guide you to say, all right, I'm going to break down this problem set here by people, process, technology, and then that's going to give me kind of this path by which I can evaluate if this is an organization that I can actually influence for the better. Cannabis, crappy industry. And I could go on for hours about, that. But I mean, just imagine sitting in a room where you're trying to build a business and you have on one side of the table a Wall Street, literally like a Wall Street investor in a suit, they're representing a hedge fund or an investment firm, or a billionaire private investor. And on the other side of the table, you have a drug dealer who rolled up in, some kitted out car and has a group of dudes outside, and you're trying to sit there and go, well, I mean, how do I run this meeting? This guy's here to make an investment, and this guy's here to make drugs, and somehow I have to get these things to work together.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Hey, so second question. I'm just gonna get my two questions out there. Have you read the book Like Work?
No, I've not.
So it's the weaponization of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We can talk about social media. I have a lot of thoughts on social media. And actually, I can tie in another one of these points because I have. What do you want to talk about social media?
So the author was P.W. Singer, and it was put out by the First Sig Commander on his reading list. And I just kind of wanted your thoughts on in terms of like how social media, because you worked intimately with Snapchat, like how social media you think may be a detriment or maybe a positive for the military or any organization that's trying to get ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a broad question.
It's a broad question. Yeah, that's okay. Well, all right. Well, let me give you kind of let me tie it into what you guys have been talking about in this class, and then I think I can go into kind of my thoughts on it. And I'll contextualize it in the fact that if you look at Burkett's fifth principle, build and bend change capabilities as an example, this is a people, process, and technology problem. So it hits all three because people, you got to be willing to change and adapt. And I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me, because social media over the last year is representative of this principle. Okay, so that's why I'm going to go through it, right? What has happened? So social media over the last 12 months, since February and March of 2020, has advanced 3 to 5 years. Okay, now think about that. Like, now, if we thought 12 months ago that everything that was happening in social media was, it couldn't go faster. You couldn't work harder. You couldn't get more out of it. You couldn't invest more in those connections. Okay, you could go 12 months ago onto LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You could make a post, and it didn't even have to be a very good post, but you would post, and you would post like every week, right? And people would interact with it. You'd get your likes, or you know, if you were very influential and you had a lot of followers, you would post maybe 2 to 3 times a day. A week. Okay, and everybody would say, all the guidance was, okay, you post on like a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday, or you post on a Tuesday and Thursday, and then you let it marinate almost, right? You let it gain traction, you let people interact with it. Now you need to post like 5 times a day because you're going to get buried by everybody else, because that has become the actual way that everybody is interacting with brands, and whether that brand is a company, whether it's a product, or whether that brand is a person, right, and an image. That level of interaction has to be so consistent now that you don't have the time to put something out there and then step back and say, okay, how did it do? You just have to be ready to begin to go to the next. On compounding that problem is the fact that it has to be good. Because if you put out 10 posts a week, 2-3 posts a day, whether it be on a story, and now you also realize that in the last 2 years, you've had an advancement of things like stories. So you had your main feed, then you had your stories, and then there's the argument that goes on, well, what goes in the feed? Because that lives perpetually, versus what goes in the story, because that's there for 24 hours. And is that my daily life? And then the things that I want people to reference in my brand and what I look like, and go back to in a year, 2 years, and tell my story is in the personal one. So there's all these other dynamics that then come into play about how do you actually interact with the different types of social media. It becomes no longer this platform where you go to do something enjoyable, see what your friends are doing. It becomes this platform that is stressful. And for people who have built an entirety of their brand and their image on social media, it can become extremely detrimental. Okay, so now if you use that to frame into context practice number 5 about build and bench change capabilities, that's what's had to happen over the last year. Anybody who couldn't take a step back and identify what was going on and then try to react and stay ahead of it has been left behind, right? And so then you look at people, right? Well, people have to be willing to change and adapt. They have to be able to identify and have the humility to identify when things are not working. The worst thing that you can hear, and we talk about it all the time in the military, is when somebody comes to you and says, well, that's the way we've always done it. I'm not joking you, because I say this a bit, but I actually heard that the other day from an employee that I was talking about. And I stopped because I was speechless. And I just said, listen, I can't believe you said that to me, because what you're telling me, is ridiculous. And so an inability to take a step back and say, this isn't working, it doesn't make sense to me, but I've always done it this way because someone told me to do it. That's the people aspect. Now, if you look at the processes have to be made to change. We talked about process flows. I was fortunate when I was in 10th group, I went to the JPRA planners course to be a personnel recovery planner. They're the best organization in the military, is the best organization in the world when it comes to process flow. JPRA and the personnel recovery process is the best process that I believe exists in the military, because not one time do they tell you what to do. The entire process is about if this, then that. And so what you have are these checklists, and it doesn't matter if it was a downed aircraft and you have to launch CSAR. It doesn't matter if you have a Navy ship that is lost at sea. It doesn't matter if somebody's been kidnapped out of a fob, okay, or runs away. None of that matters, because the process is relatively the same, but it just changes the assets that are involved. It changes the decision points that are involved. And so being able to build process that allows you to think through the if this then that scenarios at all these different decision points is extremely critical. And that's something that isn't done at in corporate America very well. It's something that military planners understand extremely well. Being able to then translate that into the corporate world, I believe is extremely critical. The days of 100-page standard operating procedures sitting in a binder, that stuff doesn't get read. And if anybody writes it, they wasted their time. Nobody's ever going to read that. Going back to your point on social media, I would tell you that 3-4 years ago, there was a timeline to replication of product. These companies, whether it's Facebook, Snap, Instagram's part of Facebook, Twitter, their ability to reverse engineer product has gone from what was months and years to hours and days. And if they don't have people on staff who can look at a product, think about Clubhouse. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Clubhouse, but Clubhouse launched, a couple of months ago. They're up to somewhere between 8 and 10 million users. They're only on iPhones and iOS platforms right now. They haven't even expanded into Android devices. But you already have Facebook and Twitter saying that they're close to full replication of that product. And what's happening is that cycle has sped up so much that it's almost impossible to stay ahead. If they don't have the staff on right there, they'll go recruit it. They'll just recruit it from whoever's building it right now, and they'll pay that person 2-3 times what they're getting paid in their current job. They'll give them a bonus on top of that. They'll lift that person out, and then they'll go and build it for them. And so the digital and social media world is moving so quickly, whether you're a user and a consumer or you're a developer, that it probably is unhealthy at some point. Does that answer your question?
Dude, that
Go ahead.
answered my question and
Yeah.
like five times over, man. I really appreciate it. I'm sure there's other
Sure.
people that have I know we were asked have some questions ready. Yeah, man, dude, I really appreciate it. That actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah, man, I appreciate your input.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was awesome. I'm taking notes here so I can ping you on that later. Because to be honest with you, I haven't heard about a lot of what you're talking about and stuff. But just when you mentioned and Jesse, as soon as I get through, let you go. You had mentioned through working with Snap and then with Genesis. And the subject of ethics came up, and you had talked about that. And what you just described in the global market or in the technology market, that, okay, a company is trying to develop some product that other company developed. And so, hey, if they're having issues, they just reach down and for all intents and purposes, just steal someone out of another environment and everything. How does that deal with from your MBA days or current things with corporate social responsibility, and how does that deal with are there no business ethics or the practice of actual business ethics put into place with something like that?
So I'm going to turn it back on you, Steve. And I'm going to give you Burkett's number 1 with lead with culture. Okay, it's lead with culture, and this is 100% a people problem. All right, and what does Burkett say in the text? Right, quote: "If employees are not learning, they're leaving." It's 100% accurate. Absolutely 100%. The military spoils us into believing that employees and ourselves don't have a choice where they work. Okay, so think about it, right? I was on an ODA. Okay, if you have bad employee, what do? You take their stuff, you throw it out in the hallway, and you go tell the sergeant major, this guy's not allowed in my team room anymore. Okay, and then most likely the sergeant major tells you don't have a choice, but at least you've proven your point. Okay, but nobody gets fired, right? You can't quit, you can't leave, right? You know, there is no choice. And so to some extent, there's a commitment on both sides of the equation in the military, and we take that for granted. It's something that we never think about, right? You're just like, okay, well, every day I wake up, I go here, I go to work, and this is my job, and that's what I do, and everybody here does their job too. Well, the real world's about choices, and with choices comes your decision based on your personal integrity and your level of ethics that generates loyalty. And loyalty, by and large, comes down to people in corporations. And it comes down to how much do you go to work every day for those around you and your leaders over the company. Companies, because the companies can be great places to work. Companies can be horrible places to work. They can give you a tremendous amount of benefits. They can make life easy. It can be, you know, they give you a million snacks and lunch and breakfast and, you know, 3 meals a day and you know, give you free swag and all this stuff. But if your boss is terrible and you don't want to go there and deal with your boss, you're going to be unhappy. The reverse is true too. If the company can give you nothing, literally nothing, but people will show up every day if they love their team, they love the people they work for and the people they work with. And so the development of that culture is extremely, extremely important, because, and as a leader, it's really difficult because turnover crushes you. And what you end up in companies getting a run, what I call a run on turnover, right? You can have somebody leave, and then people start asking questions. Oh, why did they leave? Right? Well, it depends why they left. If they left because you're a terrible boss or something happened in the company, well, now you're going to get a run on talent. And more people are going to start going out there because they're going to go, oh man, you know, I never really thought about that. But you're right. Oh wait, and you got a job going there for more money, and you know, I'm going to leave too. Also, what happens is people lift other people out. They go to a new job, they look back at their former team, and they say, who are my people here? Who are the people who supported me, made me successful, the ones that I want to work with again as I build a new organization? And they lift them out. And they take them, and so then you have a talent drain back on the other side. I've been on both sides of this. I built the program at Snap and globalized it. I hired a guy from Disney, phenomenal leader. He was a former British military officer, phenomenal leader. He built our entire learning and development program. We sent him to classes. We invested in him. What he did in the organization was one of the foundational reasons why we were set apart from every other global security department in the industry. He was there a year, and he came in and told me he was leaving. And I looked at him and was like, what do you mean you're leaving? Like, we're on like the cusp here. We're on the up and up. Everything's getting better. We've invested in you. And he wanted more. He wanted more responsibility. He wanted to grow. But I had no more opportunity for him to grow. There was no more increased scope for him. And the next role was mine. I wasn't going anywhere. So he had to go. And he left, and he went to Hulu. And he's been at Hulu for the last couple of years. And now he's the senior guy at Hulu, which is a phenomenal role for him. But that's positive growth that you have to embrace. We didn't have a run on talent after that because he was moving up. Now, on the other side of that, when I left Snap and I went to Genius, I looked back at Snap and I hired like 5 people who had made me successful in that organization, lifted them out, brought them to my team at Genius, and started building around the people who were my people, who I knew I could trust, who had my back, who understood my culture. and understood that we could move much, much faster when you take a whole bunch of people who understand how you as the leader operate. And so a meeting where I had to spend 40 minutes getting people to understand what I want becomes 5 minutes because everybody in the room goes, oh no, I know exactly what he means by that.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, and just as you were going through that, I just thought about some of the times that being a team sergeant at 043, a Halo team across the way needed a Halo qualified medic, and we just happened to have one on the mountain team. They snag him. So yeah,
Yep.
I know from a tactical sense what that means. No, thanks very much, Jesse. Jesse, go ahead. Please ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So kind of a two-parter. So back to people moving in and out of those organizations based off of other offers. Are there any like backlash, like bridge burnings that happen, or is it understood in the civilian sector that, hey, if I was in his position, I would have done the same thing, and it's a great opportunity? Or are people welcome back if things don't work out, or are they worried they're going to lose them again to another offer? Is there any of that going on?
Initially, you look and go, man, you're dead to me. You're out. But you got to be able to kind of take a step back and say, okay, it's not a stab. You're not getting stabbed in the back. You're not. It's the real world. I mean, and this guy I referenced in the story I told you, we offered him more money. I mean, we literally offered him. It was equal to what he was getting in his new job, but he wanted to be the senior person. If you have, I mean, look, I hate to say it yet. I had a junior lead. I say junior because he was under me. I had a subordinate leader who was highly, highly capable and competent. He had demonstrated everything required for him to operate at the next level. Holding it against him and holding that out on his ability to grow is unfair. It's completely unfair to him. And so, what do we say? You got to take care of people. It's mission first, people always. We weren't taking care of people if I looked at him and said, well, you're done, and I'm going to blackball you out of the industry and say bad things. No, he was a highly competent leader. He had a great offer, and so you got to, I guess, be able to have kind of the emotional strength to sit there and say, this sucks. This is terrible, and this is going to hurt our organization, and it's going to take us 6 months to a year to fill this role and get back to where we are today, but I got no choice. And so I'll go now into what's practice number 2. Practice number 2 is develop and distribute leadership. And so if you look at development and distribution of leadership as a people and a process problem, it's not the job of HR or recruiting or a learning and development team, if you even have a learning and development team, or if you even have an HR and recruiting team. I mean, remember, companies are all sizes. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, recruiting is going to do that. HR is going to do that. Well, I have my own company, and it's me, and I'm bringing on one other guy to work under me because he worked for me. He was in 10th group, and I knew him. He worked for me at Snap, and but I'm recruiting HR, operations, tech, everything. But it's not the job of everybody else, regardless of how big you are, to build a bench of strong leadership at every level. It's a top-down requirement, and it has to be the priority of all senior leaders. And you can't scale companies, and you can't create resilient companies that can sustain personnel shocks if you don't develop those senior leaders. It's just not going to happen. The military is awesome at this. I mean, we talked about it before, right? You get sent to schools, you get sent to all these things for professional development. That's constantly a requirement. That isn't so in the majority of companies. Now, there are some great companies out there that put a lot of money into development. Those companies will endure over the long term because they're empowering their junior leaders to get better. Special operations is a great example of it because of the circular approach to decisions. Not so much decisions, I shouldn't say decisions, I should say planning. And one of the things that I try to separate in my conversations with corporate leaders is because corporate leaders will say, well, you came from the military, and they just sat around and waited for you to tell them what to do. And I would say, absolutely not. I was the team leader. I didn't know anything. I had the worst ideas of anybody on the team. My entire team had been in the Army for 15, 20 years. When I went to SF, I'd been in the Army for 7 years. I mean, these guys, my team sergeant had been in 10th group for 20 years and was in the infantry for 5 years before that. Like, there's nothing I could say to that guy to be like, hey, I got a better idea. So you learn that all of this circular approach to planning is extremely valuable to advance the organization and create the best plan. You become comfortable in that. And in the corporate world, finding leadership who's able to have the emotional strength and the humility to say that I don't have the best idea, and I'm going to allow those under me to develop the plan and then execute on it, is something that I try to drive into organizations and teams and leaders, because that's the only way to advance and sustain the organization. Now, separate that though from decision making, right? If you look at how does the military centralize decision making, again, they do a great job of it. And look at a risk assessment. A risk assessment is very straightforward. There's a matrix. You fill in the numbers based on the number that gets spit out after you have your initial risk. You add your mitigation measures. It spits out a number. Depending on what that number is, tells you what commander has to sign it. It's like it's the greatest tool in the world. It's horrible when you're there. And you said there's a warrant officer here. They're the best. They're the best at filling out risk assessments. I would make all of my warrant officers do my risk assessments because I didn't want to do them. But that tool is tremendous because it tells you exactly who's the person who has to make this decision. But remember, that person who made that decision probably had nothing to do with the generation of the plan. Absolutely nothing. They own the risk. They own the decision making because of where they sit in the organization, but they're making that informed decision based on the data that's been brought to them by the person who developed the plan, who should be and is the person who has to execute that plan. And driving that into corporate organizations is something that is really, really important, but it's not very easily done. Okay, but that was your first question, right?
Yeah, and the second one I wouldn't even say is a question, but I really liked your point.
Did I answer your question? Did I answer that for you?
Yes, you did. You actually did, yeah. It's because in my mind, like, hey, we shuffle people in the military all the time, and a lot of the justification is, hey, this is more opportunity to develop this person. Oh, it might hurt my team in the short run, but it's going to develop this leader, and that's a gain for my service in the long run. But I didn't know if there was that sense of community in the civilian sector where everybody's on that same page that, if we constantly let these people better themselves, it may slow my organization down, but it's going to move the field forward potentially.
It's easy to get person-centric. So startups are the worst about this. Startups and founder-run companies are the worst about this, because what will happen is they'll exist for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and it happens today. It happens right now in my everyday, and I go in and I say, okay, well, why do you do that? Well, the founder said to do it. Okay, well, does it make sense? Well, I don't know. I think we can do it better. Well, did you tell the founder? No, it's his company. Okay, well, so what?
Yeah.
That doesn't matter that it's his company. And so in those, so you can become very person-centric in the corporate world, especially if you have leadership that's been around for a very long time, and then that creates a culture, often a very top-down culture. The military, as you referenced, is awesome about swapping people, right? And okay, I've got 2 years in this role, and then at 2 years, I'm going to go do something else. That's good and bad. That's good because it forces you as a leader to understand how to quickly assess organizations, understand what's needed to advance that organization. based on what your boss wants and what your boss's boss wants. But it also keeps you a little bit short-sighted, because by and large, there are a few commanders who take command and say, I care what this organization looks like 10 years from now. A lot of commanders take charge and they say, I care what this organization looks like 2 years from now when I'm handing the guide on to somebody else. And that becomes detrimental, because the Army song is the greatest representation of the way the world works that I've ever heard. And that is that the Army keeps rolling along. Well, companies are the same way, right? They don't, just like the military, you leave a company 6 months, your impact is there. A year, it's a little bit less. 2 years, there are a few people who might know you. And 5 years down the road, nobody knows who the hell you are. And that's the way the military works. And so what is impactful about going through those job changes every couple of years is that I think you can become more comfortable when you go into the corporate world, not after, I would say, an initial series of experiences like I've had, where you've invested everything because you approached it like you do the Army or the Navy or the Marines or your service writ large, where you're like, I'm entirely invested. Everything I do, I'm entirely invested in this organization. It's probably more beneficial to take a step back and look at it as the individual jobs that you have versus I'm going all into this one company in the way that I have to my service to the country. If that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, yeah, that does make sense. Just a short other thing I wanted to say, that I liked your point about, moving away from this SOP that no one's reading or comprehending, and going through this. I can't remember what you call it. And a couple of different things in my department where we're still stuck on SOPs, but we have incorporated a couple process flows, especially in I'm one of the hats I wear is as the camp maintenance LPO for our base. So there's so many different people who have a hand in that. It's hard to know as far as a turnover item, like, hey, this is your job now. You now have to collaborate with these 40 people. You have to know what they all do, but the process flow chart really makes that job turnover a lot smoother. And man, I wish all of our SOPs were like that. But they're not.
The process flow chart can be the SOP, right? Well, I think we're all pre-wired, because when you go to basic training, they hand you the skill level 1 book that you put in your cargo pocket, and you're like, oh, this is the SOP. It has to be written in a bound book, and I have to be able to flip through it. The SOP can be the process flow chart. It doesn't need to be some written document.
That's a great point. And hey, Jesse, you had mentioned, I mean, with your time there in Oki, and as Fran is saying, the SOP doesn't have to be something written. It can be that flow chart. And you as a leader and having this ammunition from this program in that context, being able to, as a practicum-based program, all of the classes you've taken, you can develop something like that for your workforce. It's going to benefit the organization even more so. It may take some time, but you certainly can you have that leverage to be able to work on something like that. So I mean, that's awesome. So Fran, thanks very much for that in that insight on there. Coleman has a question for you, and guys, we've got 17 minutes left in the session. So if you have a question, go ahead and either put it in the chat box or just go ahead and raise your hand and stand by. So go ahead, please, Coleman.
Thanks. Hey, Fran. So first off, thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. My question for you is going to the 4th principle within the reading is striving for results, right? Just continue to strive or seek that execution piece. I know in the military, like you said earlier, we don't necessarily have a choice with who we work with, who we work for, the organizations that we're a part of. So we just kind of have to adapt appropriately and do what's in our realm of responsibility or our scope in that certain amount of time. But the it's the Army or the military are organizations that are driven by results. Commanders care about greening slides, right? They want their numbers, they want their percentages, they want their checks, so they can tell their boss that, hey, my numbers are good, we have results. You know, senior enlisted members, first sergeants, when the sergeant major is on their ass about med pros or SRP or you know, NCOERs, why is this not quantifiable? Like, where's the percentages? Where's the numbers in here? These things. So, you know, the military is an organization, and I'm sure so are, you know, corporates, are organizations that are driven by results. You have worked in many different facets and at all levels, being a company grade officer in the military all the way to a chief executive officer in corporate. What my question to you is, are results really the main end state? Is that really the number one point? And if it's not, what are some ways to influence or some factors that can be taken into consideration to kind of gear your peers and your superiors to not necessarily look at the numbers or the percentages, but to look at maybe the process or overall how you are getting better?
Okay. Yeah. That's a really good question. And I'll just so Steve, for the group, I'm happy to stay on as long as everybody wants to keep talking. So I don't know if you're able to do that or not, but if everyone wants to keep talking past the time, I'm not going anywhere. So that's a really good question. And so now, because the only way I can answer it, so you don't think I'm bullshitting you, is to hold up the notes that I have for this session. And I don't know if you could see what I circled here, but it literally says results are all that matter in the corporate world. Okay, that's literally what it says. Results are all that matter in the corporate world. That is it. Nothing else matters. Nobody cares that you're a good dude. Nobody cares that you have a money. All of those things are great. You know, everybody wants to be. You know, they want to get to know you. They want to get to know your family, but it doesn't matter. It's the results that must be produced because there are people to answer to. I lost everybody. Are they still there? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I saw that too. It just cut out.
I got you.
Okay. Yep, you're back. Okay, so you have people to answer to. Just like in the military, we have commanders at all different levels. Companies have people to answer to. Large companies have shareholders. So everybody thinks, oh, you know, I'm going to take the company public and we're going to get rich. Well, no, probably not. I mean, you're going to get a lot of money through a public offering. But the reality is you've now taken your accountability to the public, to shareholders. And now you owe every single person who has invested by buying your stock, you owe them results, because they've taken their money and they've said, I'm investing in you and your company as you as the leader. That's why the position of CEO of a public company, you see turnover all the time for lack of results. And nobody cares that they're good people. But if you have a fiduciary responsibility to those shareholders, and the board members and the shareholders will hold you accountable. If your company is not public, if it's a private equity firm, it's a venture capital backed organization, if you're just a regular company that is taking an investment. So for example, I'm trying to buy a company right now. I'm looking at two options. One, get an SBA loan, which I want because then I'm not accountable to anybody, or I have to go get a private investor. If I get a private investor, I am accountable to that person because they've invested their money. So they care solely about the results. Now, what matters is the metrics. So what's success, right? I think part of your question that you're asking is if you look at principle number 3, because 3 and 4 kind of tie in together, right? If you look at number 3, it's execute well. Okay, well, that's I'm not sure. And Steve, don't tell Holly Burkett, that's not really my favorite one, because that's too easy. Like you have to execute well. Nobody wakes up every day and goes, today I'm not going to execute well. Like that's just not, I mean, even the worst performers don't wake up and say, today I'm going to suck, right? Everybody wants to execute well. But you have to define what is executing well. And so that definition is what matters, because that can be sales, that can be revenue, it can be net profit, it can be number of units produced. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to hate myself for saying it because it's wrong on so many levels. In the military, they're like, it's how many people did we kill? Come on, is that really a metric? Like, I don't know, maybe, sure. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's not my place, and nor do I really care. But like, that's a metric, I guess. Your role in the organization, in the company, on the team is going to be defined just like it is in the military. And then you have to have a set of metrics and a set of measurement practices that you use against that role to define, are you succeeding or not? That's probably going to change over time. It's going to change with your boss as the boss changes. And then even more importantly, it's the boss's boss who really controls what's going on, because they're the ones that control the entire chain of command. I referenced that's where I ended up in a tough spot, because I cared about what my boss said, and I knew my boss and him weren't aligned, and I kept doing it. And then eventually your boss's boss says, well, I don't need to deal with any of you folks. So that's a critical metric that a lot of people forget. I had a commander in 10th group who was awesome at that, guy by the name of George Thebes. He always said, it's about what my boss wants and what my boss's boss wants, and that's what I care about. So he understood that very, very well. But that gives you the expectation management once you understand how you and your role are defining success. If you don't have it, there's a misalignment. And if you have a misalignment between yourself and your boss, that's going to start to get very difficult very quickly onto what is expected. What are the results that are expected of you? What is the method and metrics by which you're being measured? And I'll give you an example. So I ran the company, and we had small growth in one of our business lines, meaning that sales went from 1,000 to 2,000. It went from 2,000 to 4,000. And so you had what looked like a nice growth curve. And so we would pat ourselves on the back. We'd be like, okay, great. Sales are going up. We're 2x revenue. We're 3x revenue. Well, look, our investor ran billion-dollar projects. The guy did not care at all about $1,000. I mean, these are people who spent tens of thousands of dollars at dinner. And so us going in the room and saying, hey, look we did this, there's a misalignment in expectation, because the expectation was that you're going to show me $1 million growth times 2, and next month times 3. I don't want to see $1,000 growth. And that makes for very difficult conversations. And so understanding how you're being assessed, right, is really, really critical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome answer. Okay, I'm sorry, Coleman, are you finished?
I was just going to say my other question isn't about the material itself. I was just going to ask if Fran, if you have a recommended reading list or a few things that you would recommend for people to, if it's TED Talks or whatever, and if you do have some recommendations, if you would share those with Steve so we could have access to those.
I will. Yes, absolutely. I'll share some stuff. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I started a podcast. It's going to launch in 2 weeks. I have to plug that first. So you have to listen. Everybody has to listen to the Jedburgh podcast, and they have to follow. See, I have my podcast microphone on right now, so I need everybody to listen to that. It's about leadership, and I think if you. There are a few podcasts out there, and I'll give you just a couple real quick. Tim Ferriss, and I'll share these with Steve. So Tim Ferriss is a great podcast. There's a guy named Shane Walsh. And the Knowledge Project is another good one. Strive Accelerator is a very good one because they talk about the how, and that's what my podcast, the Jedburgh podcast, is focused on. It's the how. So like I interviewed the founder of Jersey Mike's. If you're familiar with Jersey Mike's sandwich shop, it's an awesome story. The guy bought the initial store when he was 17 years old for $125,000. He had worked there when he was 14. It was the first job he ever had. And now there's 2,000 stores across the country, and they do $2 billion in revenue. It's not about the what, it's about the how. And so being able to unlock how people have found success in whether they're an athlete, whether they're in business, it doesn't matter. Those lessons are applicable even if you've never been in their industry. Yesterday, I recorded an episode with a former supermodel who has gone on. She was the face of Versace, Fendi, Donna Karan, Clinique, The Gap for from 1999 to 2007, one of the world's top supermodels. She's gone on to start a digital marketing agency as a founder and a CEO because she took her lessons learned from being understanding her personal image and developing her personal brand to now creating a business that does that for other people. And so it doesn't matter what industry we're in. I'm not a fashion model, right? None of us are, but we can learn so much about how she approached and defined success, how she evaluated herself, how she dealt with the moment. One of the things we talked about is what's that zone? Because I interviewed a guy who he was the former second baseman of the Boston Red Sox. He's in the Red Sox Hall of Fame, and we talked about the moment. That moment of being in the zone for a pitcher who has to win a game. Well, then how does that equate to a different industry like being a fashion model? And learning those things makes you better to then go into your organization the next day and start to immediately apply those things. So those, long answer, but those 3 podcasts I really like. We're trying to achieve that in ours. And then as far as books, I can share some stuff with Steve. I've been reading a lot of books recently about the people that I'm interviewing, so it's kind of like all over the place.
Awesome. Thanks, Fran. Appreciate it.
All right. Hey,
Sure, thank you.
we have Heath has the next question, and then Jacob, and then we got a couple of questions in the chat box as well. But let Heath go, and then followed by Jake. Go ahead, please, gentlemen. Heath, you're on mute. Okay, he might be having an issue with the comms, so let me go to Jake, please. Go ahead, please.
Hey, yeah. I have I've been writing down questions as they've been coming up. I got a ton of questions, so I'm just gonna stick with 2 that were really interesting to me. How did you go about successfully implementing tech in the organizations that you essentially led? For instance, you said Slack or things like SocialCast. That's something that I've noticed in our unit that we've tried to implement over and over again, and it's kind of every single turn it seems to fall flat on its face due to like an inadequacy in implementing the technology, or just not understanding what the technology is? So I just was curious about how you successfully implemented that in organizations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's reminding me of the procurement conversation we were having in the beginning, right? Everybody comes in with a new bread idea. Oh, I need this kit, I need this gear. Well, but what are you solving for, right? So it comes down to what are you solving for. And so if you look at the organization and you say, how am I assessing the organization? Now take it back to the people, process, and technology. Okay, technology is two parts. First part is your company a technology company? Is your product the technology? Okay, well, now your product may be the technology, but how you execute your business is not going to be that technology, right? That's going to be a different technology. So for example, I worked at Snap. Okay, well, Snapchat was our product. We did not do our work every day on Snapchat. We had what's called web apps, right? We had Oracle and NetSuite for procurement. We had you had Gmail, right? You had Asana for workflow. You have all these other things that are enabling you to do your job. And in every organization I've been there, we've gone through this kind of ebb and flow. And the project I'm working on right now is they provide a technology, but they're also building their systems internally on a whole bunch of disparate technologies, trying to get them all to talk to each other, because there's no one technology that does everything they're trying to do. And so the theory is, okay, well, then you kind of have to start just like APIing everything together and get it all to build, and then maybe it'll all work. Yeah, with a lot of hard work, it will. But to answer your question, what's the problem you're trying to solve for, right? And is the problem that you're trying to solve for with the technology a people problem or a process problem? And then you can take the technologies and apply some sort of evaluation criteria to them on whether it enhances your ability from a process and people standpoint, or does it not enhance your ability? Because nobody fields a technology to make things more difficult. You're fielding a technology to make things easier. And so you have to solve the problem, but identification of the problem is the number one thing. So if you were to also think about something like Slack, right? So you mentioned Slack. Well, Slack, what you can do in the basic premise of Slack, you can communicate on Google, right? You can, through their various functions, right? There's a whole bunch of different platforms that you can do communication with your company. It's like going into the liquor store and looking at the beer section when you're really thirsty, right? You don't know what kind of beer you're going to buy. You don't even know what you're trying to get out of that beer, but you're just like, I just want some cold beer that's going to satisfy my need, but you haven't identified exactly what kind you want. That's what is happening in like the procurement discussion, is people are coming in and they're like, oh, I went to a trade show and I saw this really awesome UAS system and we should field it. And it's like, okay, great, but what do you want the UAS system to do? Have you defined what you want it to do? I mean, what, and so that's where it starts, is what is the exact problem that you're trying to solve for in terms of the process and the people. And then you can go out and find the right technology. But there's so much competition in technology, it's really hard. And that's a skill. Like I suck at it. I'm not, like, I'm a kid in a candy store. Like, and my teams in all my jobs have hated me. But I had a really awesome guy. His name's Mike Taylor. He built Sony. He was the guy who built Sony's global security infrastructure for Sony Motion Pictures, but before and then after the North Korea hack. And I hired him at Snap. He knows this is all he does, like, is demo technology and put it through the ringer to create the best systems. And so when I went to Genius, he was my first hire. Day one, called him up. You got to come here. Because there are literally people who are very, very good at that. I'm terrible at it. I want to buy everything and I want it to do everything that I want it to do, but I don't know what it's supposed to do because I don't have the patience to sit there through a 5-hour demo and understand all the pros and cons. So if you find the person who actually is really good at that, then they can come back to you. And I only am answering your question because of this guy, Mike Taylor, who for 3 years of my life literally beat it into me, stop sending me these technologies because what do you want them to do? Tell me what you want them to do and I will go find the solution for you.
Yeah, that sounds exactly like what I've been. I just wanted to make sure I was on the same track because what I portray to my guys is the easy analogy that I come up with is in Ranger Regiment everybody loves guns, so I say, okay, well, if a guy comes up to you and says, I need to shoot someone, give me a Glock, and then he starts trying to shoot someone at 300 yards, it's like, do you think he's going to hit it, or do you think that maybe he should have came up and told you what he was trying to do?
Yes.
And then it's like, okay, now we can start the conversation of capabilities. So that's
exactly.
The other question. I'm gonna have to pick which one so we have time for the other guys. But I guess so. This kind of goes hand in hand with military and business world. I wrote down, how does being a CEO with shareholders work? Like, how does that relationship work? So I'm imagining that like shareholders are, whenever you were talking about going public, like, and now you're responsible, or you have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Well, I would imagine like that's kind of how I work in my shop. I have a responsibility to not only the people below me, but now I have this responsibility to like my RCO, DCO, and Sergeant Major to get them to where they're at. So I guess what I'm wondering is like how does that relationship work with a shareholder to the CEO to the shareholder, and like how do you get the shareholders to convey their intent to you?
So there's like a super technical answer to that question. And then there's like what the rest of us understand, because I probably don't know enough about the technical side to answer it in that way, but I'll just, because I mentioned it, there are certain ways that you can structure share classes that determine basically the framework of your relationship with the shareholders. And so you can determine share classes in a sense where there will be seniority in the shares, and often in founder driven companies. So like meaning that a company, a certain group of individuals or certain individuals started a company, they founded it, they built it through private investment, they took it public, they've remained now the CEO. Uber, as an example of like, Snap's an example of that. Facebook is an example of that, right? Twitter, you have Jack Dorsey, you have, Mark Zuckerberg, right? They started those companies in their, dorm room, they grew them, they took them public. Well, there are ways you can structure those share classes so that you actually retain all of the decision-making authority. If you structure it like that, then there's a disclaimer essentially in what's called the prospectus, which is what is sent to shareholders to inform the shareholder of all the legal framework of it, who like that nobody ever reads, and it basically will say in there, you're buying this share and nobody cares what you have to say. Because all of the voting rights and all of the decision-making authority is centralized in a separate share class that you, by buying this share, have agreed to waive any right to give your opinion. Now, there's other companies, and the majority of companies, who don't operate like that, and they have shareholder meetings. And so there's annual shareholder meetings where, you can have like, you can have a person who has one share, maybe they paid $25 and they have every right to go to that shareholder meeting and stand up and voice their opinion and tell you what a horrible leader you are and, all the things that you should do. But I mean, if it's like one person, I mean, you're going to take it for granted. Well, if that one person may own, 10% of your shares, which, could be possible, well, then you better listen. If it's one person who owns one share at $25, well, it's going to be a problem. No, unless you're doing something wrong that they're highlighting. So you have a relationship as the leadership of that company, wherein you have a fiduciary responsibility to that, to operate in good faith and make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization in a public company. In a private company, you do whatever you want. I mean, unless it's going to land you in jail, and then you're going to have legal issues. But I mean, as far as like who you're going to answer to, you may have a board of it, and you may have a series of investors who have committed capital in return for equity or voting rights or decision on the board, and the board may have the ability to remove you as the CEO.
Cool. Yeah, I was just really curious about that. Like I said, I have a lot more questions, but I'd like to get
we can pass I'll give you guys my contact info, my email, and my phone number, and you just hit me up, and I'm happy to hop on a call and talk more at any time.
Awesome.
All right, thank you. Heath, I see you came back up and you had a question. All right, Nick, gotcha.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, just a quick one. So Coleman spoke earlier about greening the slides, and I think in the military often we do the same thing with evaluation. So NCOERs and OERs, everyone is stellar. So that's changed some with qualified with the block checks, but still the write-ups. We teach military writing style, and we teach people how to write well and to quantify everything that they do. And sometimes it may be over quantified. I wrote a NCOER for an E7 several years ago, and the brigade XO was the senior rater. And I said, man, it sounds like this guy walks on water. But it's because, I had been trained coming up through the Army to sell everything that you do and to quantify it and to put dollar amounts. And did you see, going into the civilian world, that being a hindrance as far as when you're recruiting and hiring military personnel, that they've got these elaborate resumes because we've been trained to over quantify and sell everything? Have you seen that correlate to maybe some disparages in what they can and can't actually do?
Yes, yeah, you're gonna get me going on the on the evaluation system. Yeah, I don't. Okay, so there's like no comparison that I have found in the corporate world to the way the military evaluates talent, and that's a good and a bad thing. Like nobody does it as formally and as regimented as the military, and that's a very good thing. I mean, by and large, you know where you stand. I mean, look, it's one of the only organizations in the world that tells you you're one of 195. Right, like that's it. Like okay, like I'm 2 of 10. Right, they quantify that for you very well, regardless of what the write-up says. Now, is there like, can you have a write-up of like, a guy who was number 5 of 6, and you then read the write-up and you're like, but he's so amazing, and you're like, well, but he's 5 of 6. But still, it may be 6 who are in the top 1% of everybody else, and so like, that's still an awesome performer. It's just the bar has been elevated so much. That's hard to differentiate in not really different. It's hard to translate then into the corporate world, because by and large, recruiters, hiring managers, unless they've come from the military, don't understand what that means. Right. And so they look at it and they're like, oh, well, this guy's amazing. They've done all these things. This is, obviously easy. Or they look at it and they say, I have no idea what you've done here, but it looks cool. That happened to me. Okay. I made it to the final interview twice at Google before, right when I was getting out, before I went to business school, and Merrill Lynch. They were both chief of staff roles. Okay, so you can easily equate a chief of staff role to an aide role, because that's essentially what you are right now. Some organizations and commands have a chief of staff and an aide, but that's just because they're like, you know, 2, 3, 4-star commands, and there's a workload. Right now, there's a differentiation between those two, but by and large, for application into the corporate world, if you're an aide, you are a damn good chief of staff, okay, in the corporate world. And so you can make that link. Well, I sat in an interview where the guy interviewing me walked in, and he put my resume on the table, and he says, I don't know what you did here, but it's pretty cool, right? And then you get into things like, tell me a time when, all right? So and I think a question was something like, tell me a time, I don't know, it was like, give an experience, right? And so I give an experience of when I had to go to Nigeria after Boko Haram kidnapped 200 schoolgirls, and I'm sitting there, you know, with like a French SF guy, a British SF guy, and a bunch of Nigerian generals and the DAT, and the Nigerians are like, we don't have a problem with Boko Haram, and we're like, what are you talking about? They got kidnapped 200 schoolgirls, and you kind of tell this whole story about how like, oh yeah, so then they didn't want to do anything, so we just went to Niger and Cameroon and every country around them, and we just said, well, we're gonna give you guys money, and we're just gonna contain Boko Haram, and then when they're your problem, you'll come back and tell us. And then, you know, we did that, and we invested in all these peripheral countries, and then that contained Boko Haram, and then 6 months later they got bombed in Abuja, and then they called us back in, and they're like, we have a problem with Boko Haram, and we're like, yeah, no shit, right? And so that's amazing, you identified that, we should work together, right? You know, and they're like, yes, let's work together. And so you tell this story, and literally you're watching, and you're like, I'm all excited, right? Like, oh man, like this is so, I led this thing, I built this program, I did a lot of stuff, and then they look at you and go, I don't have any response to that, which is literally what they said. Like, I don't have any response to that, I don't know what to do with that, right? And in my mind, I'm like, I just nailed it. I nailed it. Like, I showed them that I can build any program, I can work with anybody, and that gets interpreted as, I have no idea what to do with this person, but it was really cool to talk to you, thanks for coming. You know, so it's hard. It's hard to translate so much of what someone has done. That being said, okay, we suck coming out. I gave you, when we first started, I told you the story about how I thought I could do anything, right, when I got out. And I said, I can do anything and I'll go anywhere. Like that, we look at that coming out of the military, it's ingrained into you, right? You're a problem solver. And you know, I people say to me all the time, well, what was your personality, you know, in the military? And I was like, well, I don't know. I was like a super type A Green Beret. I was a 10 out of 10 on the scale. Like, you know, there's, you know, it's just go, go, go. Nothing else matters. There's no problem too small. There's no challenge too big, right? I'm just going to figure it out. But then when somebody's interviewing you, they're interviewing you to a specific role, for something clearly defined, unless you're really lucky. And I was fortunate to be able to interview for very broad roles and get very broad roles. But by and large, they're looking for a certain specific thing that you can do. And if you can't identify with that thing, then they're going to tell you that they don't know what to do with you. They don't know how to apply that experience. We do a terrible job coming out of the military and saying, well, I can do everything, but you really can't do everything. And that's why, like, I went to business school, because I was interviewing with management consulting firms, and you have a great conversation about leadership, and then they say, here's a balance sheet and a profit and loss statement. Can you interpret where the problems are? And you look at it and say, and I was a journalism major in undergrad, so the last, you know, economics class I took was like, you know, freshman year or in high school, and I'm like, no, I don't know what any of that is. And they look at you and go, well, then what am I supposed to do with you? Yeah, you can't read financial statements. And so then you say, okay, well, I have to go learn this skill, and that's a hard skill, but you don't need necessarily to go learn a lot about soft skills because you take a lot of that with you, but there are some hard skills that have to be learned, but we don't think about those things because we say, well, I know I can't read this financial statement today, but give me a week and I'm going to go research it. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to talk to everybody I know, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to read it better than anybody else who lives in this office. But they say, well, no, I'm hiring you today because I need you to work effectively tomorrow in most organizations, which is also bad. And if you look at the Talent War Group, which is an organization that I work with on talent development and hiring and recruiting, we always say hire for character, train for skill. Hire the people who demonstrate the principles of success and then train them on these other hard skills that you can learn, and then your top end of your organization gets elevated because you don't have a cap on their capability, right? Because you've hired the most capable people. Now invest in them to train them on these hard skills. But that's not done well on the receiving end in the corporate world, and we don't do a good job coming out very clearly identifying what we're good at because we think we're good at everything. And then we make inaccurate correlations, right? Because you say, well, I was a company commander. I was in charge of 150 people, or I was a battalion commander. I had 400 people in my organization. I need to go be a CEO of a public company. And it's like, no, you're like a manager, and you get you plus 3 maybe, right? And that's really hard. Right, that's really hard to sit there and say, well, what do you mean? I had 400 people. I had 800 people in my unit. I can lead everything, and it's like, no, you can't. It's not an equal correlation, and so having to come to grips with that is really, really hard. And I feel very lucky because I was able to go into senior leadership roles, but that I also had to come to that realization when like I said, my first day at Merrill Lynch, because I had come from leading all of these elite organizations and being in the basement of the Pentagon in the things that you see in the movies. And 4 months later, I was in a cubicle in rural New Jersey, and my boss was awesome and I love him and he's one of my best friends still. But I literally put my head on the desk and was like, what did I do? Because now it's just me and all those things are about me. And so coming to grips with that is really, really challenging. And so the sooner someone's able to do that, the earlier in their transition they can do that, may be able to avoid that first couple of days in the office where they say, I used to be in charge of changing the world, and now I just got yelled at because this 75-year-old lady's Coca-Cola stock went down by 5 cents a share.
Got it. Appreciate it.
Now, thanks very much. Got a few questions in the chat box. Nick had to step out, but for the group though, Fran, he writes, given your experience in trying to affect change within organizations, how much resistance was due to people having anxiety about being able to meet those new expectations? That's first question. Second question, follow-up in that is, in your experience, what was the number one reason people resisted change, and how did you overcome that resistance?
Those are really, really good questions. Okay, you can't, I did it, I made the mistake, cannot jam change down people's throats. I learned this the hard way. I had a mentor, he's actually the chief security officer of Disney, all of Disney. And he said that to me, and this guy's story is pretty cool because he was in the FBI, he did a full career in the FBI, and then about, somewhere between, I don't know the exact time frame, but somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, Disney came to the realization that they needed somebody to run security and build a formal security program. And so they hired him, and he's been the only chief security officer at Disney that they've ever had. And I asked him, I said, how have you lasted so long in the face of so many things that have changed over the last 20 years? And he said, you cannot drive change down people's throats. You have to sit back, advise on what your change brings and how to get there, and be willing to accept a bit of loss. And so the reason why special operations, the military, and whatever you do are so effective in what we do across the globe is because you refuse to accept unnecessary risk, and our definitions of unnecessary risk get skewed often to no risk. And so what do I mean by that? I worked in global security, and I believed that we could have no incidents of workplace violence, no incidents of theft, no incidents of attempted break-in, absolutely nothing. And the way that we would do that would be to build the most intricate, complex, advanced system of people, process, and technology that is in the industry. And I believe we did that. And we sat down and gave the presentation of the 5-year plan, or the 3-year plan or something. And it was like 80 pages long. And that was about 4 to 5 times longer than absolutely everybody else in the organization. And that created fear at the executive level. And I've never been yelled at the way that I was yelled at for exposing all of the vulnerabilities that existed in somebody's baby. Because I failed to realize that everything that I was showing them needed to be fixed was the product of my audience's doing. And in one document, I laid it on the table and said, here's all the ways you're screwed up, and I'm going to fix it for you through this plan. And that was the wrong answer. So yes, it's very, very hard. So the resistance comes due to people and the way people interpret what you're trying to do. And so sitting back and saying, I'm willing to put my change out there and say, here's what I believe we need to do. This is how we're going to do it. And if they say no, sit back and say, okay. And then when the incident happens, you're the first one to stand up and say, hey, I know this happened. This is crazy. Remember when we had that conversation about that thing that could have stopped this? Should we try it now? And being that bug will get it there. Now, obviously that is not taking into account things that are of life, limb, what we call life, limb, and eyesight, right? Or things that are unethical or immoral or illegal. That's change that has to immediately be driven, and then that's where you got to be able to stand up and say, well, I'm not going to accept that you won't do this because it's immoral, illegal, or unethical.
That's an awesome response. I appreciate that. And it really, and this really kind of dovetails into Chris Calloway's question also, when you talk about resistance, and Chris is a drill sergeant at Fort Benning. And so you don't need to have any nightmares or stand in parade rest with Chris. He's actually on duty right now. But he writes, in an organization where change is only valued coming from the top down and loss of connection and community, how do you spark bottom up change and innovation? What is the key for changing culture from the bottom? And one of the things that one of the things that I teach in several of my classes that I've learned is that change begins at the top. At the top of an organization, because maybe those are the visionaries, they have the thinking, the resources, they can put the resources towards that and try and gain that buy-in. But the innovation in many aspects begins at the bottom, and I've said that in several of my classes, and I still hold pretty true to that statement as well. But so as Chris talks about, though, is how do you spark bottom-up change and innovation, and then what is the key for changing culture from the bottom? Your response, please.
It's emotional strength and team ability, curiosity, and humility. So and you're right, Steve, it's at the top. It's set. The culture of bottom-up organizations and bottom-up innovation actually comes from the top, and there are certain character traits that person at the top must demonstrate, and those character traits, and I'll describe them for you, right? Start with humility, okay? And that means that leader has to recognize that they don't have all the answers. They have to be a willing learner. There has to be an accurate self-awareness. They have to be able to seek others' input and feedback to make more educated decisions, because they understand that the aggregate intelligence of the group is greater than that of their own. It's the sum of the parts is greater than than the individual, right? So humility is the number one thing. The military, we talked earlier about people changing roles every couple of years. That actually breeds humility, because every time you change a role, you are forced as a leader to step back and learn first about the organization you're stepping into. That is super critical. And because the military is always having you change roles every couple of years, you get used to being comfortable in this position of vulnerability at the outset. Now, depending on your experience, depending on where you are in your career, depending on the organization you went into, that timeline changes, right? It may be, you may be there 2 days, and then you say, okay, we're done, stop it. This is what we're going to do, right? Or that may take a week, a month, it might be 6 months, or most likely it's going to be some iteration where you're going to immediately understand things very quickly and then start to make incremental change. And then there will be other things that take longer, and you kind of learn more and more as you go on, and then you start to make change there. But humility is the absolute number one piece of that part. The second one I think I mentioned was the team ability, and that's the prioritization of the organization's need ahead of yourself, and the fact that you need to work as a cohesive unit towards winning. Right? It's a multiplicative attitude, and so there are very few things in, I'd say, life that we get to do solely by ourselves, and again, the military does a great job of teaching us that team ability. You have to be able to rely on others. Others have to be able to rely on you. Just because someone goes in as the leader in a corporate environment, they still have to foster a team environment. They still have to be somebody that somebody wants to be around, and they have to be around their people. Now they have to be able to draw the line between being the leader and being one of the group, and that's often very hard. But building a culture of team is very critical. I mentioned curiosity, and I think this one's really important, because if you're a super type A personality, like most of us are, in coming out of the military, you don't want to question much, including yourself. And I spoke earlier about some differences in technologies between generations. Working with the millennial generation, they Google everything. And it took me like a couple of years to start to Google everything, because we weren't used to that. We may be used to it now, but growing up, we weren't used to that. Like if you wanted to go find something out, I mean, we had growing up as a kid, we had an encyclopedia, and so you kind of didn't always, because you didn't have this immediate access to information, there became a reluctance to seek the answers, right? And so you kind of either like thought about it and came up with some version that was your own manifestation of it, or you called someone and asked, right? But now a simple question comes to mind and you're just like, boom, I'll Google it. You're on your phone and you get the answer and you're like, okay, cool. Well, that's an acceptance of curiosity. And that's where humility meets curiosity, because as a leader, you're sitting there saying, well, it's okay that I don't know that, but I can kind of start to figure it out. And so exploring the unknown and questioning the status quo and this continuous growth attitude stems from curiosity. And the team will see that as a leader, right? Because a lot of times people come in and they ask the leader of an organization a question. It's really impactful when that leader doesn't just spew some garbage off the top of their head, but they say, I really don't know, but let's look it up real quick, right? And then right there, you're demonstrating humility, demonstrating that team ability to solve a problem together, and the curiosity that you've now shown that person that, hey, I don't know, but like, let's figure it out, and we're going to do that together. And then the last piece is emotional strength. And I mentioned emotional strength because you have to have emotional control in stressful situations and bring what I call calm to chaos, because building organizations where you can assume risk and allow people to fail because you're promoting this bottom-up feedback and you want to empower junior leaders, well, it means that as the leader, you have to be okay that it's not going to be perfect all the time. And if you come from where we've come from, we did a podcast the other day on the Talent War group where one of the panelists was from 275. And I asked him that question. I said, you come from, because this podcast was about failure. And I said, you come from an organization where it is literally beaten into you that you will not fail at anything that you do. And I asked him that very same question. I said, how do you build a culture where failure isn't accepted, where your entire life and career was built on a precondition that under no circumstances will you accept failure, personally or for your organization? And so it takes a tremendous amount of emotional strength to step back and say, we didn't get it right, and that's okay. We're just going to learn it and move on. So that's how I believe you build a culture of innovation from the bottom up.
That's awesome. That is an awesome response. And yeah, I always, from each of our discussions, as well as from the guys in the class as well, some of the little nuggets as well, but bringing calm to chaos. Love that line. that's great. And how you can go about that, and how you go about that within your organizations as well. And I look forward to listening to that podcast here. Get back on LinkedIn and check it out. So last question that we have here in the chat comes from Rob Hauser, who also is Chris Calloway's partner as a drill sergeant down at Fort Benning as well. Yeah,
I went to basic training at Fort Benning, so I know it. I know
Yeah.
Sand Hill well, or at least I knew the area between our barracks and where I got my head shaved at the PX every week.
There you go. So Rob's question was, what are your thoughts on change coming from the top with little to no explanation due to information dissemination? How does information go from being very informative and sensible to leaving. For example, members in a single company lost and wondering why they are doing an event or completing a task. In other words, just the orders are not clear, and how to, from your experiences as an infantry officer, as a special forces officer, as an aide, working in and around, by, with, and through to try and defeat Boko Haram by surrounding them in these countries, how do you have to look at those when completing a task to make sure that the directions are clear, or that the information you're trying to pass on is clear and that people are informed that you're going to gain that buy-in?
I want to make sure I understand the first half of the question.
Okay.
Can you just give me the first half, the first little
Well,
bit?
yeah, I mean, the way that Rob posed the question, he says, what are your thoughts on change coming from the top with little to no explanation?
Yeah. Okay. So this is, yes, I'm dealing with this right now. Literally today, I dealt with this, where I was like, where this founder I'm working with was, I can say this because he's my brother. Where he spent all night building this platform I was telling you about for recruiting, and then I said, hey, he was explaining it to me, and I said, I have a call. I have to get off the phone with you. I have a call right now with the recruiting manager, and why don't we dial her in and talk about this, because we need her input. And he says, no, I'm not done with it. And I said, well, but you don't even know if you're building it right, because she's the end user. So, and literally his position was, well, I'm going to finish building it and then we'll ask her. And I'm like, okay, well, I got bigger, more pressing issues to speak with her about, so I'm not going to argue with you right now. We're going to argue about it later. That's really bad. Like, it's really, I hate to say it, and that's not like a good term to say that's really bad, but like that's a really difficult practice. And that's not going to build a resilient or sustainable organization, because unlike the military, and we spoke earlier that everybody gets a vote, they don't have to be there. One of the lessons that I believe I learned early on in the corporate world, especially going to a company like Snap that was very young as a company, and young from an employee demographic base, is people will literally tell you no. And you go and you're in the military and you just think, well, nobody ever tells me no. Like maybe they did on an SF team because you were just being a jackass and you didn't know what you were talking about. But like, by and large, nobody really ever comes and just says, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, that literally happens in the real world, because people get a choice and they get to come in and say, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's it. We're no. And that will happen if there is not a clear explanation of what's going on. And so, as the leader of an organization, or whether it's a department or the whole company, sharing the reasons why decisions are made from the very beginning is really, really critical. You're just not going to get there. It's just not. I mean, that leader has to stand up and say, I'm going to share my reasons why. Like, and maybe it's, for some leaders, a hubris thing. Maybe they want to be the savior. They want to be able to kind of, parachute in and say, look, I solved all the problems. You don't need to know how I did it or why, but, your problems are gone. Well, that's actually going to generate less of a positive response than if the leader goes in and says, here's the problems that we're facing. These are my thoughts on them. This is what I think we need to do. What do you think we need to do?
That kind of goes right in hand with Liz Wiseman's book on multipliers, that just as you said, going in, asking that, getting that feedback, getting that buy-in and that collaboration from your workforce. So yeah, that's really, really good. Jake has one more question, but Jake, before you ask, I just wanted to bring Clarence into the conversation. I know you came in a little bit late tonight. Clarence is in the Air Force, stationed at Peterson Air Force Base. Clarence, do you have any questions or any feedback you would like to ask Fran?
Well, Dr. Horsey, thank you for the kind of the chime in there. So, to be honest, I mean, it's been a lot of information that I've been hearing tonight. It's it's a lot of stuff I'm trying to take notes on and typing up. But my only question as I'm listening would be just the whole entire thing about the trying to drive change and innovation. So I left the question, I think it was either Coleman I think it was Robert's question about change, because the organization I work for is very hard to drive change when people have been doing that same process for 10, 15, 20 years. So with your unique background and the various companies that you kind of work with, how do we, let's say on a younger and a bottom end, begin to try to drive change from our bottom side to drive it up to the top, to including results, innovation, motivation, if you want to call it that, because that's where I'm kind of stuck at right now.
Without an event, it can be hard. And what do I mean by an event, right? Like something went wrong. Because by and large in change management and some of the innovation, and probably what you're seeing is that the system is not entirely broken, in that, it's not like there's some sort of failure that's happening every day and everybody's looking around going, I don't know what to do, but just keep doing the same thing even though it's failing. They're probably, you're achieving results, but there's probably, you're looking at ways going, yeah, it's just like a better way to do this. You got to, so I had a note here, and it says managed risk is part of the journey. And you can't be afraid to take risk, because trial and error will help determine what your focus needs to be. And it's not going to be a waste of time. I think you have to seize the opportunities to educate the right people in your organization about a different perspective that you have. Now, that's really hard if your boss is one of the ones who is resistant to bottom-up input. I can tell you what not to do, which worked in my favor in the military, but I wouldn't advise it, but I'll throw it out there because it's a funny story. We were in southern Iraq, and we wanted to, I was an ODA commander, and we wanted to do this very sensitive mission that I can't get into, but my boss said no, and my boss's boss said no, but I believe they were wrong. And so then I had the commanding general and the sergeant major come for a battlefield tour, and they wanted to come and meet with my ODA. And I was able to separate the general from the sergeant major, because I knew the sergeant major was more amenable to those types of sensitive activities, if you know what I mean. And I gave him we're thinking about this. I didn't really tell him that people had already told me no, and got his buy-in. And then he went back to the general, and the general was like, that's a phenomenal idea. And then the general told my boss that we were going to do it. So I naturally got the phone call from my boss, where you have to hold it, out here. But we did it, and it was very successful. So the moral of this story is you got to find the inject point. And ideally, you want that inject point. It's easiest when it's your boss who can then advocate directly for you and for it. But if you don't have it, you don't quit. Don't give up. I mean, how many times do you hear these stories of people who fail? I mean, I heard the other day, the people who started, are you familiar? We talked about Clubhouse earlier. I'm not sure if you were on for that. The two dudes who started Clubhouse, that's their 10th tech startup. 10th. They have failed 9 times. Okay. but every time they get up and they're like, well, screw it, it didn't work. Try again, try a different angle. So don't quit, and because it's two-folded, right? It's not going to be a waste of your time. I'll give you a more realistic example. So earlier in the spring, my company shut down. I transitioned to trying to build my own security business. Terrible idea at the outset of COVID when there's no corporate security because there's nobody going to work. So like, not going to work. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to get into government contracting. And like, because I got certified as service disabled veteran owned small business. There's all these set asides. I'm like, yeah, it's competitive, but whatever. You're just going to get one, no problem. I literally wrote contract proposals for like 5 months, every day contract proposals, and they were good. Didn't get one single contract, not one contract, because like I had no past performance, right? Like I never did a security contract for the government, right? Yes, I know the industry, I have success in the industry, but what does the government look at in contracting? There's a I'm not sure, the procurement discussion, right? Well, one of the first things they look at, show me a demonstrated history of past performance in a like-size contract. Okay, here, there you go, there it is, right? And so next, right, you're out. But I learned a shitload, excuse my language, I learned a ton about how the government contracting process works. And then I got certified in New York State, which very similar, right? And now I'm buying this business in Connecticut. And the whole business scale, half of the scale model of this business is defense contracting and government contracting for subcomponent electrical parts, which there is a massive need for. And this company is perfectly positioned to seize on that. And they already have government contracts with longevity in place that will acquire. So all that time that I spent, even though there was like a good month in time, like December and January, where I was like, I wasted 6 months of my life. I'm never going to get it back. That was so stupid. I should have been focused on this other stuff. Everything I learned through that process is now going to become valuable because now I understand it and I'll apply it differently. And so I say that because you're going to move up, right? And so even if you go in all the time and nobody listens to you, at some point, you're going to be the one who gets to be of two things. One, you're going to be a decision maker and you're going to take all of those things that you learned and you're going to implement it, or someone's going to come to you and say, hey boss, I kind of was thinking about it like this. And you're going to stop dead in your tracks and go, what do you think? Because I remember when I was you and nobody listened to me. So don't quit.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Great advice. All right, and we're going to get ready to close out. I'm going to have Jake pose the last question, and then we'll get ready for closeout. Go ahead, please, Jake.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to start off by saying this has been an awesome time. Like it's been like doing a podcast, but being involved with the podcast. So this has been pretty cool. So I'm going to start the question by kind of painting the picture first. And I think this actually really ties the whole conversation we've been having together, because I'm looking at in June, moving out of my position of acquisitions and taking over a platoon called Technical Surveillance Detachment, the TSD. Yeah, and of course, being SF background, you know what they do. So the TSD is in our new stood up Regimental Military Intelligence Battalion. They've only been around for about 2 years, if that. So they have a brand new like mission, culture, everything like that. I talk with the TSD guys a lot. I've worked with them a lot before, and the TSD's mostly, if not all, composed of 11 Bravos. in a military intelligence battalion that's filled with intel analysts, EW, etc. So there's a bit of a a culture gap and a TSD's been around for a long time, but not the military intelligence battalion. The battalion has just been stood up. So so going over there, it kind of your story about coming out of the military and going to civilian life kind of is reminding me of what the guys in TSD have been telling me is like, hey, you gotta change your mindset, because the MI battalion is not like the line. So you're gonna have to change your mindset a bit, and you can't be like a bull in a china shop over here. You gotta take a step back. So I guess my question is, what is the advice that you give to a guy like you've been in your situation, coming out of the military, but a guy who's been 15 years on the line, doing Ranger stuff, special operations stuff, anything like that, type A personality, like you said, to this completely different culture that's new. They're trying to figure out their place in the regiment. Not only that, but it's a pretty big transition of a mindset. So what would be some tips and advice that you would give to a guy like me who's expecting to take over in this world?
Okay, I'm going to give credit first. I'm going to give you what my answer is, and I have to give credit to the person who told it to me, because it correlates to this conversation I was having yesterday with the fashion model I told you about, and her name is Emily Sandberg Gold. You can Google her later. But her name's Emily Sandberg Gold, and he's gonna when we release the podcast, it'll be about another month, and she'll come out at episode number 5. I asked her a very similar question. And this is the answer. Shut your mouth. It's that simple. Shut your mouth. You don't know what's going on in that organization. You will in time. But right now, it is dynamically different from what you're doing. Now, there's a reason you've been asked to go there. Okay, maybe you know, maybe you don't, doesn't really matter, right? But somebody has decided that you're the person to go there and lead that organization. It doesn't mean that they expect you to have all the answers at first. Everybody who is in that organization knows that you don't know anything about what that organization does. And so you're not fooling anybody when you come in the room and tell them that, oh, here's what I'm doing, here's what I can do. So the advice is threefold. It starts with shut your mouth. Okay. The second is listen. Okay, because if you're not talking, you're listening, which is super hard for those of us with type A personalities to do, and something my wife yells at me about consistently. And the third is read. And so, as Emily told me, right, shut your mouth, listen, read, and get educated about the topic. Then you'll know when the time to speak is, and the input will be valuable and enhancing to the organization.
That's kind of what I was getting told by the guys I'm gonna be in charge of too. So like, just shut up and just try to, or you'll just spin out of control. So that's some good stuff. I'm gonna take that with.
Yeah, I mean, what's the alternative? You're gonna go in there and tell everyone what to do. You're just gonna piss them off. You're not gonna have their respect.
Yeah, exactly. So okay.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, from the academic side of the house, Jake, if you are in line to take ORGL 406, which is Org Development Change, if you've taken it, great. If you haven't, I encourage you, when it comes time, sign up for it. I teach that class every semester, and as Fran was talking about, shut your mouth. That was that blunt type A Ranger SF response, which is awesome as well. One of the things that we'll learn, and Coleman, you'll find out about this as well, is Fran talked about when you move into a new organization or a new element, a new environment, that you have to learn the different activities, the culture, the personalities, and I'll look at those people, the processes, the technologies that are all involved. It's very important also that you unlearn things from a standpoint of biases that you may be bringing, thoughts that you may be bringing from your past assignments, your past environments into here, because that's how, as that shut your mouth really comes into play, because you have to unlearn to relearn in many circumstances. So as you move from your acquisition position to be a platoon sergeant and having all of these other experiences with you, and as you move in, be that conduit for information, as well as receiving a lot of that and exercising that communication process and stuff. So if you get into org development and change in the future, definitely we'll definitely spend some time talking about that. So I want to just thank Fran very much, and for 2.5 hours. So Fran, you'll never have me as the facilitator for one of your podcasts, because it's going to go long. But
that's all right. No, this is good, and we hit all 7 of the principles. So
yeah.
So I feel good. I feel like we
absolutely. So what I typically do in every class is I just do a little closeout. So I'm going to start with our warrant officer this evening, Mr. Charles Lotz, and just any closeout before we call it a day. Heath, go ahead, please.
I just developed my new in brief for all my junior warrant officers coming into 1st Brigade. Shut your mouth, listen, and read. That's perfect, and that's exactly what they need to do coming in. I've got 3 W1s coming in on the summer move cycle, and I mean, the first thing they do is come up and, they've gone from a staff sergeant or a sergeant first class in a lot of cases, and now they're the warrant officer, and they're expected to know everything. So the first thing they do is stop by my office and say, hey, I don't know everything yet. What do I need to do to be successful down in the battalions? And that's perfect advice. So appreciate you spending so much time with us tonight. I've learned a lot, and look forward to checking out the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Chris, can you come up on comms? Because he was on his phone on staff duty, so he may not be able to. Coleman, any final thoughts?
Yeah, hey, I would just like to thank you, Fran, and Dr. Horsley for the opportunity, both throughout these last few months in the course, and as well as you, Fran, taking the time and the effort to share your experiences here and also entertain us with our novice ideas and experience in the business realm. And it's definitely been a humbling experience, and I look forward to continue to have these types of conversations. And I would just like to ask throughout because a lot of people say it's not necessarily the end of the road or where it ends or stops, but the journey along the way. I would just like to ask, has there been any people along your career that have been mentors that specifically have done or said things to you that have ultimately shaped where you're at today, or helped you define what it is that you want, or what it is that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah. Yes. The answer is yes. The biggest influence on me was the general that I was the aide for. His name is General Jim Linder. Jim Linder was in Ranger Battalion. He was in 5th Special Forces Group. He was in Delta. He was in the unit, and he commanded the unit, and then went on to be the deputy G3 at AFRICOM, the SOC Africa commander, the SWIC commander at Bragg, the commander of all SOF in Afghanistan, and he retired after he was the SOCOM chief of staff. And he is now the president of a company called 10X Aerospace. When I became his aide in 2014, I became his aide because I opened my mouth one too many times in a series of meetings in Nigeria where everybody was telling him a bunch of bullshit. And I was the only one who sat there and was like, that's not what's happening here, sir. And then my boss looked at me and was about 2 hours after the meeting and was like, you're going to be the aide. I'm like, what do you mean I'm going to be the aide? He's like, you spoke up too many times. But I spent a year with this guy. And one of the pieces of advice that he gave me is he said, you're a victim. Everyone is a victim of their experiences, right? And at first you look at that and you say, that's negative? Well, that's not negative. That's positive. That's negative and positive, because every experience that a person has shapes them in some way. It's how the person interprets the experience that they have and what they learn from it that then shapes them for the future. And what do I mean when I say how they interpret it? Are you honest with yourself about what just happened? Right? Like,
it's funny you say that, because on our last learning and action journal that I submitted to Steve, that was my piece, was developing our grow plan. I had to painfully be honest with myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were you good enough? Were you good enough today? You know, like, did you contribute to this? You've got to be honest with yourself, and that starts there, and then you can learn from those experiences. And so that piece of advice is one of the biggest pieces of advice. Now I have 100 things that this guy used to say all the time, but yeah, I was a senior captain from Boston, who had an attitude that if somebody doesn't like what you have to say, well, tell them again until they like it. And he was what I call a Southern gentleman from Clemson, South Carolina, who got more done with a handshake and a smile and a pat on the back than anybody will ever achieve by trying to force something to happen.
Right.
And probably to some extent I still haven't learned that lesson fully. But yeah, that's who I would say is probably the biggest influence I've ever had.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Fran. I appreciate you sharing everything with us, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Chris wants to try voice one more time. Chris, can you give it a shot?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Gotcha. Yep.
Okay.
Gotcha.
First off, want to thank you, Fran, for all your time and knowledge you've given us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Horsley, for giving us this opportunity. And yeah, would love to get your contact information moving forward. I'm actually in the process of taking a med board and transitioning out of the Army after 11 years now. So definitely any time I get to pick your brain on that transition process and how to make things kind of smooth, and any tips that you have for somebody. I know me especially still got that strong type A personality, and I know moving into the business world, like you said earlier, if somebody tells you no, you can't tell them to where to put it and go ahead and drive on anyways. So much like you, that's going to be something that I have to overcome. So again, thank you for all your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I appreciate you dialing in on staff duty too. I don't miss those days.
It's not something to envy.
Absolutely. All right.
Yeah, hit me up anytime. I'm happy to talk. And it's not going to be easy. Just tell yourself that it's not going to be easy, and
Yeah.
go in there with that. Go with that attitude.
Thanks, sir.
You bet. Yeah, and I will share in a email tonight when we get through all of Fran's contact information as well. So, all right, Daryl, any final thoughts?
Sir, hey, I'm just glad that you were able to dial in and kind of talk to us. Super interesting, like roundabout way that your career has gone. I should be transitioning out here pretty soon, and I'm trying to go the different agency routes and stuff like that, and that'll show up in my grow plan whenever I submit it. No, kind of frame things is like really interesting. Yeah, that's why I kind of asked for your contact information, just be able to reach out and ask for like, hey, like what do you think about this? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yep, for sure. Yep, anything you guys need.
That's all I got.
Thanks, Daryl. Appreciate it, and looking forward to reading your grow plan as well. Okay, Jake, you any thoughts, please?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I could, talk your ear off and ask you a lot more questions. But no, this has been awesome. This has definitely been insightful, and I think that's the right word. But yeah, no, this has been a great talk, and I can't wait to listen to your podcast. What platforms are you going to be on?
Everything. At least that's what they tell me.
Everything. All right. Well, like I said, I can't wait to listen to your podcast, and you'll definitely hear from me, because I keep thinking of like constantly questions of things that'll come up. So it's going to be great to be able to bounce some stuff off of you.
Yeah, if you guys are on LinkedIn, I don't know if you guys are on LinkedIn or like Instagram. You can find me there too. And if you just connect with me there, then you'll get like all the updates and stuff, and then just shoot me a note or whatever. And Steve will give you my phone number and email address too.
All right. Yeah. No worries. Yeah, I'll just share the LinkedIn. I just took the words right out of my mouth on that as well. So, all right, guys. Hey, we will adjourn. Great way to conclude the last wonderful 7 weeks with each of you. And Fran, again, thanks very much. Heartfelt gratitude for everything that you've brought to the plate tonight. I think you've definitely captured some new followers and some new friends and some new brothers in arms and everything. So I appreciate it very much, and I'd love to make this a future event for the classes as well. So if you're
absolutely, whatever you need,
bandwidth is good, and we may just make, like Jake said, we'll just make this a podcast, for crying out loud. But you facilitate, not me. We'll never stay on time.
That's all right. Yeah, happy to do it, whatever you need. So I was once told by somebody, I think she goes by my wife, that you make time for the things that matter.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. All right, gents, take care. Get those grow plans in, and I'll talk to you all later. Don't ever hesitate to contact me if you need anything. Take care.
Okay, thanks.
You bet.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Fran.
Thank you.
Yep, Daryl, I'll send all that information in a separate email.
All right, sir. Hey, I appreciate it. I've been super busy. And I have a lot to catch up on. I'll get it to you in the next day and a half.
Gotcha. No worries. I have faith in you.
Thanks.